It is often said that history remembers the victors, but there are moments when the stories of ordinary lives, swept up in forces beyond their control, demand to be told. Few events in the 20th century have left scars as deep and enduring as the Partition of India in 1947. The subcontinent, a land steeped in ancient civilizations, cultural plurality, and religious diversity, was suddenly cleaved into two nations, India and Pakistan. The consequences of this monumental political decision rippled across millions of lives, reshaping identities, communities, and the very notion of belonging. The human cost was staggering, a tragic intersection of politics, religion, and the urgency of history's momentum. Hello, and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. By the mid-20th century, India had been under British colonial rule for nearly 2 centuries. The British Raj, as it was known, was a period marked by industrial transformation, infrastructural development, and social reform, but also by economic exploitation and political subjugation. The nationalist movements, particularly during the first half of the 1900s, had gradually cultivated a fervent desire for self-rule. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru emerged as voices of moral and political authority, advocating for independence through varying strategies of negotiation, nonviolence, and mass mobilization. Yet, alongside the dream of independence, another force was gaining momentum: the call for a separate homeland for Muslims. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the All India Muslim League, envisioned a state where Muslims could live free from the perceived dominance of a Hindu-majority India. The ideological rift between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, often framed around fears of marginalization, ultimately laid the groundwork for the partition that would follow. As 1947 approached, the British, exhausted from the financial and human toll of the Second World War, faced mounting pressure to leave India. Their decision to transfer power swiftly, while well-intentioned in terms of ending colonial rule, lacked the foresight necessary to manage the complex intermingling of religions, languages, and identities. The resulting plan, hastily drawn up, proposed the division of the subcontinent along religious lines, a demarcation that would forever alter landscapes, cities, and villages alike. The creation of India and Pakistan was not merely a political or administrative act. It was a human catastrophe in slow motion. Millions of Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were suddenly minorities in territories they had lived in for generations. Families faced impossible choices: to stay and face potential violence, or to leave ancestral homes and seek refuge across newly drawn borders. Trains, which once symbolized connection and progress, became vehicles of mass displacement, carrying desperate men, women, and children toward uncertain futures. Communities that had coexisted for centuries erupted into chaos. Neighbors turned against neighbors under the immense pressure of religious and political identity. Violence, fueled by rumor, fear, and revenge, spread with horrifying speed. Historians estimate that between 10 to 15 million people were displaced, making it perhaps the largest mass migration in human history. Cities like Lahore, Amritsar, and Delhi became epicenters of both hope and terror, where the lines between heroism and brutality blurred, leaving memories of unimaginable trauma. The sheer scale of suffering is difficult to comprehend. Families were torn apart, sometimes in a single night. Women were abducted, and countless men were killed in riots that consumed entire neighborhoods. Those who survived carried not only the physical scars, but also the psychological burden of witnessing a social fabric unravel in ways they could never have imagined. The partition was not a simple narrative of two nations emerging. It was a multifaceted tragedy, layered with human anguish, political miscalculation, and the complexities of identity. Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, stories of extraordinary courage emerged. Ordinary citizens often risked their lives to save neighbors of different faiths, showing that even in moments of mass violence, humanity could endure. Religious leaders, teachers, and local activists sometimes intervened to mediate between communities, reminding us that compassion persisted even when political structures failed. These individual acts of bravery and kindness serve as counterpoints to the overwhelming narrative of suffering, providing glimpses of resilience that history must not forget. The partition also had profound cultural implications. Literature, art, and music from both India and Pakistan began to reflect the trauma, nostalgia, and fractured identities of displaced populations. Writers like Saadat Hasan Manto and Khushwant Singh captured the anguish and absurdity of the period with piercing clarity. Their works reveal not only the violence, but also the profound psychological impact of displacement, loss, and identity crisis, allowing future generations to grapple with the moral and emotional dimensions of history beyond statistics and policy decisions. In examining the geopolitical consequences, it becomes evident that the partition set the stage for decades of conflict between India and Pakistan. Disputes over Kashmir, ongoing border tensions, and episodic warfare were all rooted in the hurried and imperfect division of the subcontinent. Internationally, the partition reshaped alliances, influenced Cold War dynamics, and became a case study in the challenges of decolonization. Scholars often debate whether a more deliberate or negotiated approach could have mitigated the human toll, but the urgency of British withdrawal, combined with escalating communal tensions, made compromise extraordinarily difficult. The social fabric of newly formed India and Pakistan required rebuilding from scratch. Governments faced the daunting task of integrating refugees, reconstructing cities, and providing for millions traumatized by loss and displacement. The administrative and logistical challenges were immense, complicated by the scarcity of resources, competing political priorities, and the persistent specter of violence. Even as borders were formalized, the legacy of fear and mistrust endured, shaping the social and political landscape for generations to come. One of the most striking aspects of the partition is how it continues to resonate today. The memories of families, the narratives of migration, and the cultural expressions of trauma remain living elements in the collective consciousness of both nations. These stories inform contemporary debates on religious identity, nationalism, and migration. They are also reminders of the fragility of coexistence and the consequences of decisions made without fully understanding their human impact. Furthermore, the partition illuminated the complex relationship between religion and politics in South Asia. It challenged assumptions about communal harmony, forcing leaders and citizens alike to reconsider the balance between cultural pluralism and political representation. The ideological divisions that fueled the partition continue to influence policy, social interactions, and national narratives, proving that history is never merely a sequence of dates, but a persistent force shaping human thought and action. Even the physical landscapes bear the imprint of this history. Towns and villages abandoned by fleeing populations were repopulated, reconfigured, or erased entirely. Temples, mosques, and shrines were left behind, often desecrated or repurposed, standing as silent witnesses to the upheaval. Roads, once vibrant with trade and communal festivals, became corridors of fear and migration. The physical scars, though sometimes subtle, are embedded in the memory of the land, serving as constant reminders of a pivotal moment in human history. As historians and storytellers, it is essential to examine the partition not only through the lens of political expediency or religious ideology, but through the lived experiences of those who endured it. Personal narratives, diaries, and oral histories reveal nuances that statistics and policy documents cannot. They provide insight into the human dimension of migration, the moral dilemmas faced by ordinary individuals, and the ways communities adapted or failed to adapt to catastrophic change. The partition also forced questions of identity to the forefront. People who had long identified as simply Indian or Pakistani suddenly found their citizenship, religion, and personal history politicized and contested. This abrupt redefinition of self led to complex negotiations of belonging, citizenship, and cultural memory. For many, the psychological impact of being uprooted and reclassified was as significant as the physical relocation itself. Generations that followed would continue to navigate the tension between inherited trauma and new national identities, illustrating how historical events reverberate across time. Moreover, the impact on women was particularly profound and tragic. Women were subjected to abductions, sexual violence, and forced conversions, often becoming symbolic battlegrounds in a struggle over honor, community, and political control. Yet, many women exhibited resilience, finding ways to reclaim agency, protect their families, and rebuild lives amidst chaos. Their experiences challenge simplified narratives of victimhood, highlighting both the vulnerabilities imposed by conflict and the extraordinary strength of human survival. The economic consequences of partition were similarly devastating. Trade routes were disrupted, agricultural cycles interrupted, and entire industries destabilized. Refugee population. As the first trains carrying refugees crossed the newly defined borders, the enormity of the situation became tragically clear. Scenes of desperation and confusion unfolded on platforms and along rail lines. Families huddled together, clutching what little they could carry, often separated in the chaos of hurried boarding. Food and water were scarce, and the journey to safety was fraught with danger. Attacks on convoys became common, turning transit into a perilous gamble where survival was never guaranteed. Amidst the fear and uncertainty, local communities sometimes extended acts of kindness. Temporary shelters sprang up wherever space allowed. School halls, temples, mosques, and government buildings became impromptu refuges. Volunteers, both local and from relief organizations, distributed food and clothing, attempting to mitigate the overwhelming suffering. Though these efforts could never fully address the scale of the crisis, they provide a glimpse into human solidarity during one of history's darkest episodes. The psychological impact of the partition on children was profound. Many were witnesses to extreme violence, losing parents, siblings, and friends. Those who survived carried the trauma into adulthood, shaping generational attitudes toward trust, identity, and belonging. Childhood memories were permanently marked by images of fleeing families, burned villages, and the stark realities of displacement. Scholars studying intergenerational trauma in South Asia note that these early experiences significantly influenced social behavior, political perspectives, and cultural memory for decades. Meanwhile, the administrative task of partitioning resources between India and Pakistan proved labyrinthine. The division of military assets, civil services, and financial reserves required negotiation under immense pressure, complicated by mutual distrust. Even simple matters, such as the allocation of water resources and railway lines, became highly contentious, sometimes leading to armed skirmishes. The haste and imperfect communication during this process exacerbated tensions, illustrating the immense challenge of creating two viable nations from the remnants of a single vast colonial entity. Religious identity, long intertwined with daily life and community, now became a matter of state. Schools, marketplaces, and public spaces experienced sudden and dramatic shifts. In regions where Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs had once lived side by side, demographic transformations were rapid and profound. Entire neighborhoods emptied of former residents and were repopulated by newcomers who carried with them their own traditions, fears, and expectations. This physical reconfiguration mirrored the emotional and cultural upheaval experienced by individuals and families. The partition also triggered a wave of artistic and literary reflection that continues to shape South Asian consciousness. Authors, poets, and filmmakers grappled with themes of loss, nostalgia, and moral ambiguity. Their works often juxtaposed the horror of violence with the enduring beauty of the subcontinent, reflecting a deep ambivalence toward change. Cinema, in particular, became a medium through which collective memory was preserved, with films depicting both the human cost and the resilience required to endure. These creative expressions offered catharsis for audiences and a means of documenting experiences too vast to capture solely through political or historical analysis. One striking example is the literature of Saadat Hassan Manto, whose short stories provided unflinching portrayals of human behavior during partition. His works reveal the thin veneer separating civility from brutality and how ordinary people could be drawn into acts of violence by fear, rumor, or circumstance. Manto's narratives do not offer simple moral judgments. Instead, they confront readers with uncomfortable truths about the human capacity for cruelty and compassion. Beyond literature, oral histories emerged as critical resources for understanding the lived experience of partition. Families passed down stories of migration, separation, and survival, creating intergenerational repositories of memory. These narratives often highlighted acts of heroism, moral dilemma, and unexpected kindness, painting a richer, more nuanced portrait of a period frequently reduced to numbers and borders. Scholars, historians, and educators have increasingly turned to these oral testimonies to construct a fuller understanding of partition, recognizing that human memory carries dimensions that official records cannot convey. Religious institutions played complex roles during this period. Some facilitated relief efforts, providing food, shelter, and protection for those displaced or vulnerable. Others, however, became embroiled in sectarian tensions, whether intentionally or inadvertently, contributing to cycles of violence. The interplay between spiritual leadership and communal politics demonstrated both the potential for moral guidance and the dangers of ideological entrenchment. It was a period in which the responsibilities of faith were both tested and magnified by extraordinary circumstances. Economic dislocation during partition cannot be overstated. Skilled laborers, artisans, and traders found themselves stranded or forced to relocate, disrupting local economies and trade networks. Agricultural production suffered as land ownership changed hands abruptly, and landlords, farmers, and tenants navigated complex new legal and social arrangements. In urban centers, businesses faced closures, looting, or nationalization, while refugee populations required employment and housing. Governments had to respond rapidly, balancing immediate humanitarian needs with long-term economic recovery, often with limited success. Gender dynamics during partition revealed the intersection of vulnerability and resilience. Women, in particular, faced targeted violence, yet they were also central to the survival of families and communities. Mothers, sisters, and daughters often became protectors and negotiators, safeguarding children and possessions during perilous journeys. Their experiences highlight the duality of human experience in conflict, extreme suffering coexisting with extraordinary strength and agency. The stories of these women remain crucial to understanding the human dimension of partition. Religious and cultural festivals, once communal in nature, became sites of contestation and negotiation. Shared traditions, previously markers of coexistence, now had to be navigated carefully in the context of newly defined national and religious identities. Rituals, prayers, and celebrations were adapted, relocated, or abandoned, reflecting both the practical and emotional consequences of forced migration. The cultural landscape was thus reshaped not only by demographic changes, but also by the psychological and spiritual recalibration required in a divided land. In examining the role of leadership during partition, one observes a mixture of vision, pragmatism, and miscalculation. Figures such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah had to balance immense political pressures with the ethical and logistical realities of mass displacement. While their decisions were often guided by ideology and principle, they were constrained by circumstance, limited information, and the sheer scale of events unfolding around them. Their legacies, complex and contested, continue to spark debate among historians and citizens alike, reflecting the enduring moral and political dilemmas inherent in partition. International attention, while present, was limited. The British, as the departing colonial power, were criticized for the speed and inadequacy of their transition plan. Global media covered the events unevenly, often focusing on political declarations rather than human suffering. Relief efforts by neighboring countries and international organizations were mobilized, but could not fully address the scale of the crisis. Partition thus became a striking example of how geopolitical and humanitarian responsibilities can collide, revealing both the possibilities and limitations of global intervention. Relocation camps set up to accommodate displaced populations became temporary communities in themselves. These camps faced overcrowding, disease, and scarce resources, yet they also fostered new social networks and cultural exchanges. Refugees established schools, marketplaces, and religious centers, attempting to recreate aspects of normalcy amidst uncertainty. Over time, these camps transformed into permanent settlements, leaving enduring marks on urban and rural geographies. They became microcosms of the broader struggles of partition, spaces where resilience, adaptation, and social cohesion were tested continuously. Partition also altered the demographic contours of both India and Pakistan dramatically. Cities like Lahore, which had been predominantly Muslim, became central to Pakistan, while Delhi absorbed significant numbers of Hindu and Sikh refugees. The movement of populations reshaped electoral, linguistic, and cultural dynamics, influencing policy and societal norms for decades. These demographic shifts were not merely statistical, but had profound implications for social integration, minority rights, and national identity. Education systems were similarly impacted. Schools and universities had to adapt curricula, integrate displaced students, and cope with the psychological trauma experienced by learners and teachers alike. Institutions in both countries faced shortages of staff and materials, necessitating creative solutions to maintain continuity. Over time, educational reforms attempted to address these disruptions, but the immediate post-partition period was marked by improvisation and resilience on an extraordinary scale. The psychological landscape of partition survivors reveals a complex interplay of memory, guilt. The human stories of partition are sometimes eclipsed by the scale of political and historical analysis. Yet it is in these personal narratives that the true magnitude of the event is felt. In villages along the Punjab, families carried possessions on ox carts and on foot, moving into territories where they were strangers. The journey was not just physical, it was a transition of identity, culture, and community. People had to navigate unfamiliar social hierarchies, adapt to new linguistic and administrative environments, and rebuild lives from the fragments of displacement. The refugee experience also highlighted the resilience of ordinary people. Markets were reestablished, places of worship reconstructed, and schools reopened, often in makeshift buildings. Communities developed informal networks to share resources, protect the vulnerable, and create a sense of normalcy. In the chaos of migration, these grassroots efforts became critical lifelines, demonstrating human ingenuity and solidarity under extreme stress. Yet, the trauma of partition left psychological scars that endured long after borders were formalized. Survivors frequently recounted nightmares, recurring memories, and anxiety rooted in the sudden upheaval of their lives. Children who witnessed violence often carried these experiences into adulthood, shaping their worldview and social interactions. Psychologists studying post-traumatic migration note that these experiences can influence family dynamics, educational achievement, and social trust across generations. Partition, therefore, was not a moment in history confined to the year 1947. It was a continuing human condition with ramifications for decades. Religious sites became both symbols and targets during the partition. Mosques, temples, and gurdwaras were abandoned or repurposed as communities fled, while some were desecrated during violent outbreaks. These acts were not just physical, but deeply symbolic, representing the severing of centuries-old communal bonds. At the same time, the preservation and restoration of certain religious structures in newly formed nations became a means of asserting cultural and political identity, embedding religion into the national narrative of both India and Pakistan. The urban landscape was equally transformed. Cities like Amritsar, Karachi, and Delhi saw dramatic population shifts almost overnight. Residential patterns, marketplaces, and transport systems had to adapt to the sudden influx or exodus of populations. Former neighborhoods emptied of their longtime residents were repopulated by refugees, sometimes leading to tension, negotiation, and conflict over resources and rights. Urban planning, emergency services, and governance were challenged in unprecedented ways, testing the capacities of both nascent nations. Partition also had a lasting impact on social hierarchies and caste dynamics. In India, many Hindu and Sikh refugees resettled in regions where their caste identities affected access to employment, housing, and social integration. Similarly, in Pakistan, Muslim migrants navigated existing local hierarchies that shaped opportunities and social acceptance. The interplay between displacement, identity, and social structure created a complex landscape in which historical inequities were both reinforced and challenged. The arts responded to partition in ways that reflected both personal grief and societal reflection. Paintings, theater, poetry, and literature grappled with themes of exile, loss, and the moral ambiguity of survival. Visual artists depicted trains filled with refugees, abandoned homes, and scenes of violence, creating works that communicated emotion beyond words. Theater productions dramatized family separations and the moral dilemmas of protecting life in a time of chaos. These artistic interpretations offered audiences a way to engage with history emotionally, bridging the gap between memory and understanding. Cinema, emerging as a powerful medium in the mid-20th century, also captured the partition experience. Filmmakers explored the human impact, creating narratives that intertwined personal stories with political realities. Films became repositories of collective memory, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. Audiences connected to these portrayals not only because of their historical fidelity, but because of the universality of themes such as survival, loyalty, and the struggle to retain humanity amid adversity. The cultural transmission of partition experiences extended across generations through storytelling and oral tradition. Families recounted journeys of escape, loss, and resilience, embedding these narratives into their identity. Elders emphasized moral lessons, practical strategies for survival, and the importance of remembering the past. These intergenerational transmissions reinforced community bonds and shaped attitudes towards national identity, religious tolerance, and cross-cultural engagement. At the political level, the partition set the stage for enduring tension between India and Pakistan. Disputes over territory, most notably Kashmir, led to multiple wars and continued military standoffs. The psychological impact of migration, violence, and displacement contributed to narratives of mistrust and hostility that influenced diplomatic relations. Each successive generation inherited both historical memory and geopolitical consequences, demonstrating how partition continues to shape the political landscape of South Asia. Education as a tool for social reconstruction took on new significance in both nations. Schools were tasked with integrating refugee populations, teaching civic responsibility, and fostering national cohesion. Curricula were adapted to reflect new national narratives, emphasizing unity, cultural heritage, and the lessons of partition. Teachers and educational administrators worked under challenging circumstances, often with limited resources, yet played a crucial role in shaping post-partition societies. The role of international actors during partition offers further insight into the complexity of decolonization. Britain's hurried withdrawal, driven by domestic political pressure and economic exhaustion, left a vacuum that exacerbated local tensions. The United Nations and other international organizations offered limited assistance, largely constrained by logistics and political considerations. Partition thus stands as a case study in the limits of external intervention during periods of rapid social and political transformation. Economically, the partition disrupted trade networks that had been established over centuries. Ports, railways, and markets were suddenly divided, forcing merchants and laborers to adapt to new borders and regulations. In some regions, refugee populations revived local economies by establishing businesses, farms, and workshops. In others, shortages and dislocation led to long-term stagnation. These economic shifts were inseparable from the political and social upheaval, demonstrating the interconnectedness of human systems in times of crisis. The psychological toll of partition extended into family structures. Many families were separated permanently, and reunification was often impossible due to deaths, missing persons, or political barriers. These ruptures shaped kinship networks, inheritance practices, and community cohesion. Children born in the midst of migration sometimes grew up without knowledge of ancestral villages or familial traditions, creating a generational gap in cultural memory. Partition also reshaped the role of women in society. While many faced unprecedented vulnerability, others assumed leadership roles in navigating migration, managing households, and protecting children. Their experiences revealed both the limitations imposed by violence and the extraordinary resilience that human beings can demonstrate in times of crisis. Stories of women rescuing neighbors, negotiating safe passage, and maintaining social cohesion underscore the complex interplay between gender, survival, and agency during partition. Religious and cultural life had to be reimagined in the wake of partition. Festivals, rituals, and community gatherings were relocated or adapted to new contexts. People reconstructed spaces of worship, integrated displaced cultural practices, and maintained traditions in diaspora communities. These efforts reinforced continuity amidst disruption and highlighted the adaptive capacity of human culture even under extreme stress. The influence of partition on literature cannot be overstated. Beyond Monto, writers like Khushwant Singh and Bapsi Sidhwa chronicled human experiences with piercing clarity, blending historical events with personal narratives. Their works provided insights into moral ambiguity, communal tensions, and the psychological impact of forced migration. Literature became a medium for processing trauma, educating future generations, and grappling with the ethical dimensions of history. Migration patterns initiated by partition also shaped the urban and rural landscapes for decades. Settlements grew around refugee populations, creating new neighborhoods and towns. These communities developed distinct identities, blending traditions from their places of origin with those of the host regions. Over time, these patterns influenced political representation, local governance, and economic development, illustrating the long-term consequences of mass displacement. Partition also had significant implications for governance and public administration. Both India and Pakistan had to establish bureaucracies capable of handling refugee resettlement, law and order, and social welfare. Governments faced the dual challenge of immediate humanitarian crises and the longer-term demands of state building. Policy decisions, from resource allocation to integration strategies, required balancing limited capacities with the immense needs of populations uprooted by partition. Health systems were stretched to their limits. Refugees arrived with malnutrition, injuries, and disease, creating public health emergencies. Hospitals and clinics often lacked adequate staff, supplies, and infrastructure. Medical professionals worked under immense pressure to provide care, prevent epidemics, and maintain public health standards. These challenges underscored the interdependence of human health, governance, and social stability during periods. The aftermath of partition revealed the fragility of social trust. Communities that had once interacted daily in markets, schools, and neighborhoods found themselves navigating suspicion and fear. Interpersonal relationships were recalibrated based on religious identity, political affiliation, and perceived loyalty to the new nation-states. This erosion of trust was not merely a temporary phenomenon. It reverberated through generations, influencing social interactions, marriage patterns, and local governance. In the political realm, partition set precedents that would shape South Asian diplomacy for decades. The division of territories, particularly the contentious region of Kashmir, became a central point of tension between India and Pakistan. The conflict over Kashmir fueled multiple wars, ongoing border disputes, and enduring distrust, embedding partition's legacy deep into the geopolitical landscape. Each military confrontation, each ceasefire, and each negotiation is shadowed by the memory of 1947, a testament to how historical trauma can influence present-day politics. The psychological landscape of survivors was complex. Refugees who had lost homes, livelihoods, and family members struggled to reconstruct not only their physical lives, but also their sense of identity. Communities had to reestablish social hierarchies, create new traditions, and negotiate their place within unfamiliar territories. These processes were fraught with tension, uncertainty, and the constant negotiation of belonging. In many cases, the trauma of migration persisted, shaping family narratives, educational choices, and career paths. Partition also forced a re-evaluation of citizenship. Individuals who had lived for generations in one region suddenly found themselves stateless or reclassified under new national laws. Legal frameworks for citizenship, property ownership, and residency had to be rapidly implemented, often with inadequate records and limited oversight. The consequences were profound, affecting access to education, employment, and social services, and generating disputes that would persist for years. Education systems in both countries had to adapt to accommodate the influx of refugee children. Schools were overwhelmed, teachers stretched thin, and curricula were modified to reflect new national narratives. Yet education became a critical tool for social integration and nation-building. Classrooms became spaces where children learned not only reading and writing, but also the principles of citizenship, morality, and communal coexistence. These efforts highlighted the transformative potential of education amidst social upheaval. The role of the media during partition was pivotal. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth became critical channels for information about safe routes, aid distribution, and political developments. However, misinformation and sensationalist reporting sometimes exacerbated violence and fear. Journalists working in these conditions faced immense challenges, balancing the urgency of reporting with the ethical responsibilities of accuracy, neutrality, and public safety. Their work created a historical record, albeit one filtered through human perception and limited access. Cultural life continued to adapt despite displacement. Refugees carried culinary traditions, clothing styles, music, and language with them, transplanting fragments of their heritage into new environments. Over time, these elements blended with local practices, creating hybrid cultural expressions. Festivals, religious observances, and communal rituals became vehicles for continuity, memory, and resilience, allowing communities to maintain a sense of identity even in unfamiliar surroundings. Economic restructuring was a pressing concern. Agricultural lands, commercial enterprises, and artisan workshops had been abandoned or destroyed during mass migrations. New settlers had to revive production, rebuild marketplaces, and establish networks of trade and communication. Governments provided some support, yet the scale of need often exceeded capacity. In many cases, informal economies emerged, fostering innovation and resilience in the face of scarcity. Women's roles during partition were particularly multifaceted. While many suffered violence and loss, women also became the linchpins of family survival, negotiating safe passage, managing scarce resources, and preserving social cohesion. Their experiences highlight the intersection of vulnerability and strength, illustrating how crises can both impose limitations and catalyze empowerment. Women's stories are essential for a comprehensive understanding of partition's human dimension, revealing courage, adaptability, and moral complexity. The arts served as both reflection and catharsis during this period. Literature, theater, and visual arts grappled with themes of displacement, loss, and resilience. Writers and artists sought to process the chaos, creating narratives that humanized statistics and political decisions. Paintings depicted fleeing families and devastated landscapes. Poetry explored moral ambiguity and grief. Plays dramatized family separations and ethical dilemmas. These artistic interventions offered survivors a means to articulate trauma and preserve collective memory. Cinema, emerging as a powerful medium, became an important vehicle for storytelling about partition. Films captured the human experience, presenting narratives that intertwined personal struggle with broader socio-political change. Directors depicted both the horror and resilience of the era, offering audiences an emotional and historical lens through which to engage with events. Cinema thus became a vital repository of cultural memory, shaping public understanding and influencing generational perceptions on partition. Oral histories and personal testimonies remain invaluable for comprehending the human impact of partition. Families shared stories of journeys across borders, encounters with violence, and acts of heroism. These narratives provide texture and nuance often absent in official documents, revealing the complexity of human decision-making under extreme duress. They also highlight the moral ambiguity of survival, illustrating how ordinary people navigated impossible choices with courage, pragmatism, and at times regret. Religious leaders played critical and sometimes contradictory roles during partition. Some facilitated humanitarian aid, provided shelter, and intervened to prevent violence. Others became embroiled in communal tensions, consciously or unconsciously amplifying fears and hostilities. These divergent roles underscore the moral complexity of leadership during periods of upheaval, demonstrating the potential for compassion and the dangers of ideological entrenchment. Partition's economic consequences were widespread. Trade networks were disrupted, industries faced shortages, and labor markets were destabilized. Refugees, often skilled in agriculture, craft, or commerce, had to adapt to new economies, sometimes creating innovative solutions to meet immediate needs. Urban centers faced the dual challenge of integrating displaced populations while maintaining essential services. These economic pressures influenced policy, urban planning, and social integration strategies for decades. The psychological impact of partition extended across generations. Children who experienced displacement often carried trauma into adulthood, influencing social behavior, trust in institutions, and attitudes toward interreligious interaction. Survivor narratives highlight the enduring nature of trauma, demonstrating that historical events can leave deep psychological imprints that shape family dynamics, educational opportunities, and political perspectives long after the immediate crisis has passed. Social networks proved essential for survival. Refugees relied on extended family, neighbors, and community associations to navigate logistics, access resources, and maintain emotional support. These networks facilitated both practical survival and moral reassurance, creating bonds of solidarity in a time of fragmentation. Over time, these informal support systems contributed to community resilience and a reconstruction of social cohesion. The legal and administrative challenges of partition were immense. Governments had to establish mechanisms for refugee registration, property allocation, and citizenship determination. Courts and tribunals were overwhelmed, and enforcement of legal rights often relied on local authorities or community mediation. These processes highlighted both the limitations of administrative capacity and the critical role of local governance in mitigating the impact of large-scale displacement. Partition also profoundly reshaped the cultural landscape. Neighborhoods, towns, and cities were redefined as populations moved across borders. Religious sites were abandoned or repurposed, marketplaces were reestablished, and public spaces adapted to new social realities. These physical transformations mirrored the broader psychological and cultural shifts, underscoring how political decisions manifest in tangible everyday life. Memory and commemoration play a crucial role in understanding partition. Monuments, museums, and memorials attempt to encapsulate the human experience, yet no structure can fully convey the scale of trauma or resilience. Survivor testimonies, family stories, and artistic expression preserve the moral and emotional dimensions of this history, offering future generations insight into the lived experience of displacement, violence, and reconstruction. International perspectives on partition were mixed. While some observers praised the end of colonial rule and the creation of sovereign nations, others recognized the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding. Relief efforts were constrained by logistics, political considerations, and limited resources. The world's response underscores both the possibilities and limits of international engagement in domestic crises, providing lessons for future humanitarian interventions. The psychological effects of migration included profound disorientation, identity crises, and moral dilemmas. Individuals were forced to reconcile the loss of homes and communities with the necessity of. As the years passed, the scars of partition became embedded not only in the land, but in the collective consciousness of both India and Pakistan. Entire generations grew up with stories of journeys undertaken under duress, of loved ones lost, and of communities reconstituted from the ashes of chaos. These narratives shaped notions of identity, belonging, and morality, influencing social norms, political debates, and cultural expression. The legacy of partition was thus both tangible and intangible, an enduring influence on the psyche of millions. Refugee settlements evolved into permanent neighborhoods, towns, and even cities, altering the urban and rural landscape permanently. Economies were rebuilt, schools reopened, markets flourished, and social institutions adapted to accommodate new populations. Yet the imprint of loss remained, evident in empty homes left behind, cemeteries abandoned, and shrines desecrated or left untouched. These spaces acted as silent witnesses to the upheaval, a reminder that history is inscribed not only in books, but in the physical and emotional environment. The process of rebuilding required immense resilience. Individuals who had experienced violence, displacement, and loss had to establish livelihoods, integrate into unfamiliar communities, and nurture social cohesion. Social networks became lifelines, providing resources, information, and emotional support. Communities often relied on religious and cultural institutions to stabilize life, offering a sense of familiarity and moral guidance amidst uncertainty. These grassroots mechanisms of survival reveal how ordinary people, through cooperation and innovation, mitigate the consequences of political upheaval. Partition also had profound implications for gender relations. Women who survived violence often became central to family survival, mediating between generations, negotiating with local authorities, and ensuring the safety of children. Their agency, while shaped by necessity, challenged traditional norms and demonstrated adaptability in the face of crisis. Stories of women protecting others, organizing relief, and rebuilding communities illustrate the essential role of female resilience during moments of historical trauma. The psychological consequences were deeply felt. Survivors often experienced grief, guilt, and anxiety, which affected family dynamics and social cohesion. Intergenerational trauma emerged as children inherited memories and attitudes shaped by the harrowing experiences of their parents. These legacies influenced community interactions, political perspectives, and cultural identity, showing that the effects of partition extended far beyond the immediate moment of migration. Religious and cultural life required adaptation. Rituals, festivals, and religious observances were transplanted or reimagined, allowing communities to maintain continuity despite displacement. Artistic expression flourished as a means of processing trauma. Literature, painting, theater, and cinema explored themes of loss, survival, and moral complexity. These cultural artifacts preserved human experiences and ethical dilemmas, ensuring that the lessons of partition would remain accessible to future generations. The education sector, too, had to respond rapidly. Schools were re-established to accommodate refugee children, teachers faced new curricula, and communities invested in learning as a means of restoring normalcy. Education became a tool for social integration and nation-building, fostering civic responsibility and cultural continuity. Institutions of higher learning also adapted, shaping the intellectual and professional development of generations born into the aftermath of migration. Internationally, partition provided lessons on the complexities of decolonization. The British exit, motivated by political and economic pressures, revealed the difficulties of transferring power in ethnically, religiously, and culturally diverse territories. The limitations of external intervention highlighted the importance of local governance, preparedness, and sensitivity to human consequences. Globally, partition became a reference point for understanding forced migration, refugee crises, and the responsibilities of departing colonial powers. Partition also redefined the social fabric. Communities previously interconnected along religious and cultural lines were suddenly segregated, necessitating the rebuilding of social norms and hierarchies. Trust had to be renegotiated, and new forms of cooperation and conflict resolution emerged. Over time, these processes created distinct social and political identities, influencing civic life, governance, and cultural expression in both India and Pakistan. Artistic expression became a vital avenue for understanding and processing partition. Writers, poets, filmmakers, and visual artists documented human experiences, creating a narrative counterpoint to official histories. Their works revealed moral ambiguities, emotional depth, and the complexity of human behavior during crisis. Through literature and art, the experiences of ordinary people, often overshadowed by political analysis, were preserved, giving voice to those who endured and ensuring that history remembered the human dimension. Oral history became a critical mechanism for preserving memory. Families recounted migration stories, acts of courage, moments of moral choice, and the navigation of complex social landscapes. These personal narratives provided depth, emotional resonance, and nuance, challenging simplified accounts of the event. They also reinforced communal bonds, transmitting lessons about resilience, ethics, and human dignity to subsequent generations. Political structures, though formalized through the creation of India and Pakistan, were continuously tested. Border disputes, particularly over Kashmir, fueled recurring conflict, influencing domestic policies and international relations. The legacy of partition informed military strategies, diplomatic negotiations, and national narratives, demonstrating how historical events shape both immediate and long-term geopolitical realities. Economic recovery required creativity. Refugees brought skills, knowledge, and enterprise to their new communities, rebuilding trade networks, establishing businesses, and revitalizing agriculture. Government policies sought to manage resources, integrate displaced populations, and stabilize economies. Despite challenges, local ingenuity and adaptation often compensated for administrative limitations, illustrating the capacity of societies to reconstruct under adversity. Psychologically, partition generated profound questions about morality, survival, and identity. Individuals and communities faced impossible choices, balancing personal safety with ethical considerations. Stories of heroism and moral courage coexist alongside accounts of betrayal, violence, and loss, reflecting the complexity of human behavior under extreme circumstances. These moral narratives continue to inform contemporary discussions on ethics, responsibility, and historical accountability. Cultural adaptation was a defining feature of post-partition society. Communities preserved linguistic traditions, music, culinary practices, and religious rituals, blending them with new environments. Festivals and public celebrations became markers of resilience and continuity, reinforcing communal identity while facilitating integration. This adaptive cultural practice illustrates the enduring power of human creativity in response to disruption. The legacy of partition extends into memory, commemoration, and education. Museums, archives, and memorials preserve artifacts, documents, and testimonies, ensuring that future generations understand both the human and political dimensions of this history. Educational initiatives foster awareness of moral, ethical, and social lessons, reinforcing the importance of empathy, tolerance, and critical reflection. Partition also shaped demographic patterns permanently. Migration altered urban and rural populations, creating new settlements and transforming existing ones. Over time, these demographic changes influenced political representation, social interaction, and economic development. Communities developed distinctive identities, rooted in both origin and adaptation, demonstrating how displacement reshapes societies over the long term. Interpersonal trust and social cohesion, tested during partition, required careful reconstruction. Community leaders, religious authorities, and local institutions played crucial roles in mediating conflicts, providing resources, and fostering reconciliation. These efforts highlight the importance of social capital, leadership, and collaboration in rebuilding societies after large-scale crises. The psychological, cultural, and economic consequences of partition continue to resonate today. Stories of displacement, moral courage, and survival inform contemporary debates on nationalism, religious tolerance, migration, and human rights. These narratives remind us that history is not merely a series of dates or policies, but a lived experience, deeply embedded in human consciousness and society. In conclusion, the partition of India was a moment of immense historical, human, and cultural significance. It reshaped borders, identities, and societies while leaving a lasting imprint on politics, culture, and human consciousness. Its lessons extend beyond South Asia, offering insight into the moral, logistical, and emotional complexities of mass migration, nation-building, and the human cost of political decisions. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.